Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and in this video lesson I'm going to cover the concepts and requirements of cryptography for the SSCP certification exam. Cryptography is the intersection of math and security. The math behind it is pretty crazy and pretty complex, and if you're into math, it's really fascinating. If you're not into math, don't worry, I'm not going to go too much into the details of how it actually works, because the nice part about cryptography is some math geniuses have done all the hard stuff for you, and they just give you some apps and settings. But you still need to understand the concepts of cryptography, both for the real world and your certification exam. Cryptography is primarily used for three different things: encryption, which is protecting data confidentiality; hashing, which is protecting data integrity; and digital signing, which can provide authentication and non-repudiation. So let's talk about each of those in more detail. Of course, we know what confidentiality is. It's protecting data. It's allowing only the people who are authorized to see something to see it. Well, encryption can protect data both in storage while it's on your hard drive and in transit as it crosses networks. The nice thing about encryption is only somebody with the decryption key will be able to make any sense out of the file. So control access to the decryption key, and you provide access control for your data itself, even if it leaves your network. Non-repudiation is getting some assurance that if somebody says they sent you a message, that they really sent it. Think of it this way: if Microsoft releases an update to your computer, well, you'd probably want to install it, but how do you know that it didn't come from a malware manufacturer that wants to install some bad software on your computer? Digital signatures and non-repudiation. Microsoft signs the updates with cryptographic certificates that they hold the private key to. And you can use asymmetric cryptography to verify their certificate, and we'll get into that in more detail. But digital signatures have become so important to the way we distribute software updates and also communicate on the internet. Hashing provides a unique code based on the contents of a file or any particular block of data. If you change one part of that data, it's going to generate a different hash. Now, the nice thing about a hash is it's a fairly small bit of data that can represent a very large piece of data quite uniquely, not perfectly uniquely, but quite uniquely. And this allows you to detect changes in data, in files. Therefore, if somebody takes Microsoft's signed update and they inject their malware into it, hashing allows you to detect that the file has changed, and then you won't install it. And in fact, software does all that for you automatically. And as I mentioned earlier, encryption provides access control because only people with a decryption key can decrypt the data. Therefore, keep that decryption key protected, give it to only authorized users, and you're providing access control for data even when you don't have access control lists available. So let's talk about how encryption works. You always start with plain text. That's just what we call it. It's the data that you want to send somebody that you don't want everybody else to see. Then you pick your encryption algorithm. This is some incredibly complex mathematical process that handles the data and transforms it into something else. Encryption algorithms always accept a key. The key is unique to you, and you need to keep it secret. When you use the encryption algorithm to process the plain text, you come up with ciphertext. Ciphertext looks like gibberish. It looks like completely random numbers, and the best encryption algorithms will indeed produce basically random ciphertext. However, your original plain text is still in there, and you can pull it back out. The decryption algorithm takes your ciphertext and extracts the plain text back out of it using the decryption key. We'll cover more details about different encryption algorithms in the upcoming slides. What you see here is the Caesar substitution cipher, named for Caesar himself because he did use it, and it simply replaces a letter of the alphabet with some subsequent letter of the alphabet, and you can see they remain in the same order. It's really easy to create tools to help you with this substitution. You can just create two rings that rotate around each other and pick the offset and then go through and replace letters in a note that you might get. Unfortunately, there are really strong weaknesses with a substitution cipher. For example, it's exceptionally easy to determine the substitution simply by examining the words. The biggest flaw is that spaces don't get translated. Therefore, you can look for one-letter words. In English, a one-letter word is going to be either an A or an I. Then, by just looking at the frequency of different characters, you can begin to figure out some of the other letters. For example, the most common three-letter words are and the. If you see a lot of three-letter words and they follow the same patterns, chances are good it's the, sometimes it's and, but you can go through and kind of take a guess and replace some of the letters in there and get a good idea about it. You can also look at the frequency of letters in the alphabet. You know that S and T and E and A are more common than W and Z and X. Therefore, letters that are used frequently are probably substituted with A or E or one of the other common letters. Now let's talk about the difference between symmetric and asymmetric encryption. Up first, symmetric encryption. With symmetric encryption, you use the same key to encrypt and later decrypt. So it's basically like using a password. This is a challenge though because you have to get your encrypted message to a person, but you also have to tell them the password so that they can decrypt it. So think about it, if you're sending an encrypted document through an email, what would you do? Would you type the password in the email? If somebody managed to steal the email, then they would get the password and they'd be able to decrypt the document, completely destroying your security efforts. So I guess you could call him up on a telephone and hope that whoever managed to intercept the encrypted document wasn't able to intercept their call. That's called an out-of-band communication. It's kind of a pain though. It certainly wouldn't work well on the internet. I mean, can you imagine if you needed to transmit encrypted documents to lots of users? You wouldn't want them all to call you and get the password. And I guess you could text it to them. Anyway, it gets to be a real problem trying to transfer this secret without letting anybody else see it. Because after all, the whole point of encryption is its security, but in plain sight. When you have this shared secret, you can't put it in plain sight, which means you then need to find some different security mechanism, and it just makes everything harder. Symmetric encryption is very, very fast compared to the alternatives. The strength of symmetric encryption is determined by a couple of different factors, and the most important is the length of the key. So you'll often hear about encryption algorithms bragging about their key length. 64-bit, 128-bit, 164-bit, 256-bit encryption. The longer, the better, generally, though, of course, the algorithm itself is very important, and as well, the number of iterations going through the algorithm. So we'll discuss encryption algorithms in more detail in a different lesson, but there's DES, which is not a great algorithm, and then there's triple DES, which goes through the DES algorithm 3 times. Adding those extra iterations improves the strength of the encryption. Symmetric encryption is vulnerable to brute force attacks, as is just about every part of security. Somebody basically has to just keep guessing different keys until they stumble across one that works correctly. If the encryption algorithm is effective and the key is long enough, though, the number of brute force attacks will be in the, I don't know, zillions, some really high number, and could take thousands and thousands of years to perform, even with the fastest computers. Therefore, you're going to be long gone before anybody could ever crack it, and it's generally secure enough. Now let's talk about asymmetric encryption. With asymmetric encryption, you have a separate encryption key and decryption key, but they have a special relationship with each other. The two keys are called your public key and your private key. The public key you can send out to anybody, and the private key you have to keep secret. If you need to send somebody an encrypted message, you ask them for their public key, and they can just give it to you. A public key infrastructure is built into a lot of organizations. It allows you to automatically retrieve their public key, making that completely automatic. Now that you have their public key, you encrypt the document and you send it to them. They can decrypt it with their private key, but they can't decrypt it with the public key. So anybody can retrieve that public key, and nobody will ever be able to decrypt that document. The recipient, presumably, has kept his private key secret. Therefore, he'd be the only person that could decrypt it. This mathematical relationship between the public key and the private key is fascinating, and it's pretty irreversible. You can't look at the public key and ever figure out what the private key is, at least without thousands of years of brute force attacks. To compare and contrast both asymmetric and symmetric cryptography, asymmetric allows for public key transfer. You don't have to worry about secretly transferring a password or anything, but it's really slow. Symmetric cryptography, on the other hand, is really fast, but you have this burden of key transfer. In practice, what protocols do is they take the best of both worlds. They use asymmetric cryptography to send a secret key. For example, imagine that you have to transmit several gigabytes of encrypted data. It would be really slow to use asymmetric encryption for the entire thing. So what you would do is you would take the recipient's public key and use it to encrypt a symmetric key, a password. Then send them the encrypted password. They'll be able to decrypt it with their private key. Now, you can use that password that you both know to use symmetric cryptography to encrypt and then decrypt the data. Symmetric cryptography is really fast, and we used asymmetric cryptography to take care of that key transfer. This combines the best of both worlds, and you'll see it used throughout different cryptographic protocols, such as HTTPS on the web, which is used to visit banking and other types of secure websites. Digital signatures are a great use of asymmetric cryptography. If you think about it, you really just need to know that somebody is the genuine holder of their own private key, because only one person should have access to a private key in an asymmetric key pair. If you see that somebody encrypts something with a private key, then you can know that it is that one person that you gave that private key to. Anybody on the internet can take data that's been encrypted with the private key and decrypt it with the public key. Therefore, the encryption itself isn't effective at keeping a secret, but it does prove that whoever had the data also held the private key. This is a digital signature. It proves that the data was encrypted by the owner of the private key in a way that provides non-repudiation. Nobody else could pretend to have encrypted it. And indeed, if, say, the contents of the message were something illegal, the owner would have a really difficult time proving that it wasn't him. He would have to show that somebody else had hold of his private key. This also proves that the message wasn't altered during transit, because if it were altered, it would not decrypt properly with the public key. There are a couple of different general types of encryption algorithms, and the most common is a block cipher. A block cipher takes a fixed length of data and pushes it through this encryption algorithm, and then spits out another fixed length of data. They need these blocks of text to be 512 bytes or 1024 bytes, and if it happens to be shorter, maybe you're at the end of a page or the last 20 bytes of a document required going into a new block, well, these algorithms will pad it, hopefully with something not too predictable. By breaking data into blocks, the encryption algorithm doesn't have to process the entire movie file, for example, all at once. It breaks it into smaller chunks and allows the computer or whatever it is to process it using the amount of available memory. In other words, it's a performance benefit. It requires you to deal with data in small blocks instead of one huge block. The other option is a stream cipher. Stream ciphers always use symmetric key encryption, and they can process a continuous stream of bytes. So basically they're encrypting one letter at a time rather than encrypting an entire block. Stream ciphers are extremely fast and they use less processing power. However, the encryption generally isn't as strong as a block cipher. Note that this is not the same as a substitution cipher, even though a substitution cipher could be used as a stream cipher. Proper stream ciphers are much more sophisticated, and they will process each individual letter differently. So they won't process the I and N in exactly the same way as the N. If you have multiple I's in a message, they won't all come out being the same alternate letter. I just want to mention elliptic curve cryptography, sometimes known as ECC. It's an asymmetric cryptography method, and it basically just simplifies the math so that you can generate these public and private key pairs without massive amounts of computing power. That's it. I'm not going to go into the math. I just wanted you to be familiar with the term and know what it did. Now let's talk about hashing. Hashing is another cryptographic math function. And what it does is it takes a big block of data and makes a unique representation for it. If you change any byte of data in the big block, something will change in the smaller block. By having this hash uniquely represent a big block of data, you can detect whether somebody changes something in the big block of data. And hashing is just a fundamental part of cryptography, and the technique is used in applications and protocols all the time to just verify that data hasn't changed. Hashing is a one-way algorithm. So when you create this little hash, you can never get back to the original data, even if the original data is very short. As an application developer, one of the first security techniques that you learn is to not store passwords in a database. If you store a password in a database, somebody can hack your database and then know everybody's passwords. So what you do instead is you store a hash of the password. Later, if you need to verify somebody's password, you simply rehash whatever it is they typed in. Then you look up that hash, and if you find a matching hash, well, that's the matching password. Here are some examples. As you can see, the inputs on the left get processed by a cryptographic hash function that outputs a digest. This message digest is the hash. It's the short phrase that represents the longer phrase. As you can see, the digest stays the same length, even if the input is longer or shorter. If you look at the last three inputs, you can see that they are modifications of the second input. Only the second input is correct. The last three have been modified in some way. And if you look at the digests on the right, you can see that the digest changes substantially. If you change one letter, more than one letter, and the digest changes, the digest itself is completely different. This allows you to detect any changes in the input. For example, if you had a plain text document and a digest of it, a hash of it, you could compute the hash of the plain text document and compare it against the digest that was provided to you by the person sending the file and make sure that the file itself hadn't been corrupted. So to reiterate, any change you make to the input makes a change to the digest. And you can never return to the original input using the digest only. Now let's talk about how to combine digital signatures and hashing to allow you to verify the owner of a document without requiring you to do this costly and processor-intensive asymmetric encryption on an entire large document. We'll start out with a plain text message, apply a hash function to it to generate a hash digest. Next, we'll take that hash digest, which is presumably much shorter than the message itself, run it through an asymmetric encryption algorithm using the sender's private key to generate this digital signature. So a digital signature is just an encrypted hash of a document. Now we have the original message and a very small digital signature. Send that to the recipient. It can just be in regular email. You don't have to worry about somebody intercepting it. The recipient separates the message from the digital signature, runs the message through a hash function. This is simply redoing what the sender did in this first step here. If nothing has been modified, this hash will equal this hash, and they'll know the file hasn't changed. Next, they decrypt the digital signature using the sender's public key. This restores the value here. If these two match, then we know the document hasn't changed since it was digitally signed. So far we've been talking about encrypting documents and data that you're sending. Let's talk about transport encryption, which is encrypting the stream of packets going between two computers. It's extremely important because it's really easy to sniff network communications, as I show you in another lesson. However, if you encrypt data during transport, then somebody can sniff it and it just looks like gibberish. You can't tell too much about what's going on. Transport encryption is commonly used in HTTPS. Anytime you visit a banking website or an e-commerce website, if somebody prompts you for your password or a credit card number, you better be looking up in that address bar for HTTPS. That means transport encryption is hiding all your data from people who would sniff it. Virtual private networks, VPNs, also use transport encryption. They just take everything that's going anywhere, encrypt it, pack it into a tunnel, and send it off to a remote VPN server. But because it's encrypted, if somebody intercepts it, they can't see your data. Many apps have encryption built into their protocols. For example, the SMIME protocol, and there's secure versions of SMTP and the post office protocol and IMAP for email messages. Just about every modern major protocol has a separate version of it that includes some encryption. And finally, I'd like to talk about steganography, which is kind of a fun form of encryption. What steganography does is it hides messages within another message. It's not necessarily even encrypted, but it is hidden. So these messages can be hidden in plain sight, as they say. And it's not that you couldn't find the original message, though it might also be encrypted. The point is you don't notice it. So you can hide text in an image, audio, or video file. For example, if you were to hide it in a picture, you could put something in the picture's metadata. Or you could alter some parts of the picture in such a way that you couldn't quite see the difference. Imagine if you had a picture of a bird and you just picked a random pixel and made it a little bit lighter. If the recipient managed to find that picture and they had the original picture, they could compare it, find the differences, and then use those slight but not noticeable differences to extract your original message. Another way to do that is to simply disregard the last bit in every byte of an image file. Most image files, including JPEGs, will be 24-bit. They have 8 bits for red, 8 bits for blue, and 8 bits for green. That's a total of 24 bits. What you can do is you can disregard the last bit in each one of those blocks of 8 bytes. And that's only going to change the visible color by less than 1%. So you can throw away that last bit and do whatever you want with it, and nobody will notice in the picture itself. However, you extract all those last bits and you can make a proper message out of it. So you can hide text messages within images, and audio and video files are even bigger, and it makes it really easy. Now, steganography works best in digital format where messages aren't going to degrade. However, it can be done in analog formats. People have hidden messages in music that's broadcast across the radio and TV that's broadcast across the airwaves. Before the electronic era, spies that were embedded in countries would use public newspapers to communicate. For example, you could take out a personals ad for a pretty low cost and embed your own private message within the personals ad. Thousands of people might flip through and read the personals message, and it would look like a regular personals message, but the recipient of that message would know to look for specifics in it. For example, it might be the phone number that would be important, or it might be every third word in the message, or they might just have specific patterns that they know mean something else. If you look online, you can find freely available steganography tools that will let you cram your message into just about any type of file you want and then later extract it out. It works best with media files because they can usually tolerate some modification without anybody noticing. Finally, last slide, here are a few just cryptography tips that I want to pass on. You probably won't see these on the exam, but I just want you to know them for the real world. First, don't worry so much about brute force attacks. I've seen people trying to pick an encryption algorithm and they just sweat it all day long, and they're figuring out how many thousands of years before a computer can hack it. Well, even the fairly weak encryption algorithms that are commonly used nowadays will take thousands and thousands of years. So unless you're a government organization, don't sweat it. As long as you're doing some cryptography, that's probably good enough. Chances are good nobody's going to put the energy in to try to crack it. On the other hand, you should worry about algorithm flaws. I wouldn't use an algorithm that hadn't withstood the test of time, because new algorithms come out all the time, and peers review it, and sometimes they find serious flaws that allow them to be cracked really easily. I kind of demonstrated that earlier with the Caesar substitution. It just had a critical flaw that allowed it to be cracked, and guess what? Armies died because of it. So be careful about choosing your algorithm. You also need to stay up to date on news and cracks, because in the past we have discovered flaws in algorithms, and suddenly everybody's data who was encrypted with that algorithm, well, it wasn't safe anymore. And you might hear something in the news and need to go back and change your algorithm. You need to decrypt all your existing data and then re-encrypt it with a new and safer encryption algorithm. So it's really important for you to stay up to date on the news. It's also important for you to use centralized key management and to back up your keys. Because after you encrypt something, if you lose your key, guess what? You're just like an attacker who doesn't have the key. which means if you want to get to the data, you're going to need to spend thousands of years trying to crack it. So you can lock yourself out of your data just by losing your key. Just about every encryption tool out there will prompt you to back up your keys, but I see people skip that stuff all the time, and I think, what are you going to do if you have a file corruption? If your disk drive just messes up a little bit and your key isn't stored anymore, you're never going to be able to access any of your files again. So back it up, and centralized key management in large organizations basically takes the burden off of the individual for managing their own keys. You'll have them all stored in one safe place because you can't trust your thousands of employees to each individually remember to back up their key and to keep that key safe. So you can use tools like Microsoft Active Directory to automatically back up keys distributed throughout your whole organization. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.